A pampered blonde draped her legs across the empty seat. Her bratty kid smeared chewed gum like graffiti. When the quiet veteran in his worn uniform offered a gentle word, they sneered. But thousands of feet above the Atlantic, a chance encounter would shatter that indifference. A sudden accusation ripped through the cabin, dragging a buried tragedy into the light. The cabin hummed with the generic drone of a long-haul international flight, a metal tube suspended thousands of feet above the vast expanse of the Atlantic. Scattered pockets of light illuminated the rows of reclining seats, each occupied by a traveler cocooned in their own world of half-sleep, digital entertainment, or quiet contemplation. Near the window, in seat 14A, sat John. His age was etched into the lines around his eyes and the slight stoop of his shoulders, somewhere in his early 60s. He wore a familiar uniform, a faded olive green that spoke of years of service, though the crispness had softened with time. It wasn't the combat dress one might readily associate with a soldier, but rather the less flamboyant attire of peacekeeping missions, a testament to a different kind of service, one often unseen and unacknowledged back home. The fabric, though worn, was meticulously clean, the seams still sharp. On his chest, a single, slightly tarnished service pin glinted faintly in the overhead light, a silent marker of his past. He shifted in his seat, a sigh escaping his lips. The economy class accommodations offered little comfort for a man of his build, and the stiffness in his joints, a souvenir from long deployments in unforgiving terrains, protested with every movement. His gaze drifted out the window, where the endless expanse of clouds mirrored the vastness of the memories he carried within. There was a weariness in his eyes that went beyond physical fatigue, a deep-seated ache that spoke of burdens carried in silence. He wasn't asleep, but his mind seemed to be elsewhere, lost in a landscape only he could see. He clutched a worn leather wallet in his lap, its edges softened by years of handling, perhaps containing a picture of a loved one or a memento of a time long past. A small commotion rippled through the relative calm as Sarah and her son, Alex, made their way down the aisle. Sarah was a striking woman in her mid-40s, her blonde hair impeccably styled, her designer handbag slung carelessly over her shoulder. Her every movement exuded an air of practiced sophistication, bordering on imperiousness. She spoke loudly into her phone, her tone impatient, punctuated by the sharp click of her high heels on the cabin floor. Alex, a whirlwind of 7 or 8 years, trailed behind her, his energy a stark contrast to the subdued atmosphere of the plane. He clutched a half-chewed stick of bubblegum in his hand, leaving a faint, sticky trail on the armrests as he navigated the narrow passage. He seemed oblivious to the glares of his fellow passengers, his attention solely focused on the imaginary adventures unfolding in his young mind. Sarah, still engrossed in her call, seemed equally unaware of her son's antics or the general inconvenience they were causing. Her brow was furrowed, a clear indication of her displeasure at the airline's reported delay, a grievance she was now audibly sharing with the unfortunate recipient on the other end of the line. Her voice, though polished, carried an edge of entitlement, a sense that her time was far more valuable than that of those around her. As they reached their seats, directly in front of John, Alex, momentarily bored with his imaginary games, found a new source of amusement. He pulled the chewed wad of bubblegum from his mouth, his small fingers stretching it into a gray, pliable mass. With a mischievous grin, he leaned forward and deliberately plastered it onto the back of the seat, right at John's eye level. He giggled softly at his handiwork, a childish prank born of boredom and a lack of awareness of personal space. John, who had been lost in his thoughts, felt a slight pressure against his back. He initially dismissed it as a fellow passenger shifting, but then a faint, sweet scent reached his nostrils, followed by a subtle stickiness. He frowned, a sense of unease creeping in. With a sigh, John leaned forward slightly and addressed the boy in a calm, measured tone. "Excuse me, young man," he said gently, his voice carrying a quiet authority honed by years of peacekeeping diplomacy. "That's not a very nice thing to do. Someone has to sit there." Sarah, finally concluding her phone call with a curt, "I'll deal with you later," turned around, her expression one of annoyance at being interrupted. She glanced at the offending blob of gum and then at John, her eyes narrowing slightly. There was no hint of apology in her gaze, only a thinly veiled irritation that this unassuming man had dared to address her son, Alex. She said, her tone sharp and perfunctory, "Say sorry to the gentleman." Her eyes, however, conveyed a different message, a silent reprimand directed at John for making a fuss over a trivial matter. Alex, sensing his mother's dismissive attitude, merely stuck out his tongue at John, a childish act of defiance mirroring his mother's unspoken disdain. He then turned back to the window, his attention already flitting to something new. John, a veteran of conflicts and tense negotiations, was not easily intimidated. He met Sarah's cold gaze with a steady, unwavering look of his own. There was no anger in his eyes, only a profound sadness and a weary disappointment. He had seen this kind of self-absorption before, this casual disregard for others, and it always left him with a familiar ache in his chest. It was the same indifference he sometimes felt from a society that had largely forgotten the quiet sacrifices made by those who served in the name of peace, in the long, often thankless, years between the headline-grabbing wars. For a fleeting moment, Sarah's polished facade seemed to waver under the weight of his gaze. Perhaps she caught a glimpse of the quiet dignity in his bearing, or perhaps it was the unspoken history etched on his face. But the moment passed quickly. She tossed her hair, a gesture of dismissal, and turned back to her son, effectively ending the interaction. John slowly leaned back in his seat, the sticky residue on his back a tangible reminder of the unpleasant encounter. He looked out the window again, the clouds now seeming less like a peaceful expanse and more like a reflection of the growing unease within him. The journey had just begun, and already, a subtle yet significant conflict had been ignited, a small spark that held the potential to illuminate deeper, more profound stories waiting to be told. The steady hum of the jet engines created a hypnotic backdrop to John's thoughts, each vibration a subtle reminder of the miles separating him from his destination and the past he was revisiting. This wasn't a casual trip, it was a pilgrimage driven by a deep sense of loyalty and the weight of shared experience. He was flying to see Thomas, a man who wasn't just an old army buddy, but a brother forged in the crucible of forgotten conflicts. They had weathered scorching desert deployments, navigated the treacherous politics of fragile ceasefires, and mourned the silent departures of good men whose names would never grace the evening news. Thomas was fading, the vibrant spark that John remembered so well dimming with each passing day. John felt a profound need to be there, to sit by his bedside, perhaps to share a quiet joke or a knowing glance that encapsulated years of unspoken understanding. In Thomas's presence, John felt seen, his sacrifices acknowledged without the need for lengthy explanations or justifications. Their bond was built on shared hardship, on the unspoken language of soldiers who had witnessed the best and worst of humanity in places most people couldn't even locate on a map. This journey was a testament to that enduring connection, a final salute to a comrade whose quiet service deserved to be remembered, even if only by one old friend. He hoped to bring a small piece of home with him, perhaps a worn photograph or a shared memento that would spark a flicker of recognition in Thomas's weary eyes. Yet, as the aircraft sliced through the upper atmosphere, carrying him closer to one chapter of his past, it simultaneously stirred another, far more agonizing one. The memory of the peacekeeping mission gone wrong was a persistent shadow, a stain that no amount of time or distance could fully erase. He could still vividly recall the dust-choked air, the cacophony of panicked voices, and the sickening thud that had signaled the tragic loss of innocent lives. Their unit, tasked with the impossible mission of maintaining peace in a land fractured by generations of conflict, had become the target of blame, a convenient scapegoat in the aftermath of the disaster. The official inquiry had been swift and, in John's eyes, woefully inadequate, driven more by political expediency than a genuine search for truth. The weight of collective guilt, unfairly placed upon their shoulders, had followed them home, a silent accusation that lingered in the eyes of some and the awkward silences of others. For John, the memory was a visceral ache, a constant replay of what he believed could have been different, the what-ifs that haunted his sleepless nights. He saw the faces of the children caught in the chaos, the bewildered grief of the survivors, images seared into his memory, a heavy burden he carried in the solitude of his thoughts, a stark contrast to the relative peace and comfort enjoyed by those oblivious to such realities. The casual disregard exhibited by Sarah and her son amplified John's internal turmoil. Their world, seemingly insulated from the harsh realities he had witnessed, highlighted the chasm between those who had served and those who hadn't. The carelessly discarded trash in the seat pocket, the loud, one-sided phone conversation conducted without a thought for fellow passengers, the deliberate defacement of shared property, these seemingly minor acts of self-centeredness grated on John's nerves, each a small reminder of the broader societal amnesia regarding the sacrifices made by veterans. They had stood as a buffer against chaos, witnessed the fragility of human life, and returned to a society often preoccupied with trivialities. Sometimes even viewing their service with indifference or, worse, suspicion. The sticky residue on his back, a childish prank, became a tangible symbol of this disconnect, a physical manifestation of the lack of consideration that sometimes felt endemic. It was a stark reminder of the quiet battles fought and the invisible wounds carried by those who had answered the call, often to be met with a world that had moved on, seemingly unburdened by the weight of their service. Several rows behind John, David remained a study in quiet intensity. His face, etched with the lines of hardship and perhaps a long-held sorrow, was fixed on the back of John's head. He hadn't moved much since the flight began, his posture rigid, his gaze unwavering. There was a palpable tension radiating from him, an air of someone wrestling with powerful, internal emotions. But as the journey progressed, his focus narrowed, his eyes scrutinizing the faded uniform John wore, the single service pin a focal point of his intense observation, a flicker of recognition, sharp and sudden, crossed David's features, quickly followed by a surge of something akin to anger, a long-dormant resentment stirring to life. He leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest, his breath catching in his throat. The pieces of a long-buried memory were clicking into place, the image of that uniform, so similar to one he had seen before under vastly different and tragic circumstances, triggering a visceral reaction. A name, heavy with unspoken grief and accusation, escaped his lips in a barely audible whisper, a ghost from the past made present in the close confines of the aircraft. "It can't be," he murmured, his eyes locked on John, the quiet journey about to be violently disrupted by the resurfacing of a shared, painful history. The strained silence that had settled over the cabin was shattered by David's anguished cry. He lunged forward slightly, his knuckles white as he clutched the worn photograph. "You," he repeated, his voice raw with decades of grief and a simmering resentment that had finally found its target. "John. I recognize that haunted look in your eyes. You were there. You were the one in charge that day. My Sarah. Her laughter. Her light. Extinguished because of a decision you made." The photograph, a snapshot of youthful joy, trembled in his shaking hand as he held it out for the entire cabin to see, a silent accusation aimed directly at John. A palpable wave of discomfort rippled through the passengers. Conversation ceased, digital screens went dark, and every eye in the cabin was drawn to the dramatic confrontation unfolding in the aisle. Sarah, who had been idly scrolling through her phone, looked up sharply, her initial annoyance quickly morphing into a stunned fascination. Alex, perched on the edge of his seat, his earlier mischief forgotten, stared with wide, innocent eyes at the raw emotion radiating from the two men. The air crackled with unspoken tension. John recoiled as if physically struck by David's words. His breath hitched in his throat, and the color drained from his face, leaving it pale and drawn. He stared at David, his eyes reflecting a maelstrom of shock, disbelief, and the agonizing resurgence of long-suppressed trauma. "No, please. You don't understand," he stammered, his voice barely audible above the hushed whispers of the other passengers. "I was part of the unit. I was there. But the orders, the decisions, they weren't mine to make. There was a chain of command. Protocols." His words fragmented, failing to articulate the complex reality of that horrific day. The memories flooded back, the chaos, the confusion. The impossible choices made under duress, a weight he had carried in silence for years, now dragged into the harsh light of public accusation. The image of the young woman in the photograph pierced through his defenses, a stark reminder of the innocent lives lost, a burden that had haunted his waking hours and troubled his sleep. "Understand?" David's voice rose again, laced with a bitter edge of incredulity. "Understand that my sister, my vibrant, beautiful Sarah, is nothing more than a faded photograph because of your command? Because of your actions?" Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks, blurring the image he clutched so tightly. "You wear that uniform, a symbol of duty and honor. While her life was stolen. Do you even remember her face?" Just as David's grief threatened to overwhelm the tense atmosphere of the cabin, Sarah, in a surprising turn, stepped forward. Her initial irritation had vanished, replaced by a keen sense of observation and a growing empathy for the raw pain on display. "Sir," she said, her voice calm and measured, cutting through the emotional turmoil. "With all due respect, perhaps there's more to this story than meets the eye. I've been watching Mr. John, and there's a profound sadness in his demeanor, not the look of a man burdened by guilt for a deliberate act." She then turned to John, her gaze now holding a flicker of understanding. "Mr. John," she said softly, "I sincerely apologize for my son's earlier behavior. It was inexcusable." A hint of professional curiosity then sharpened her tone. "But this accusation. What exactly happened?" Her instincts as an investigative journalist had been fully engaged. The intensity of David's grief, coupled with John's almost broken denial, suggested a far more intricate narrative. "I am a journalist," she stated clearly, her eyes now fixed intently on David. "And I've spent years researching a particular incident. One that bears a striking resemblance to what you're describing. An incident where the official account, the one that placed blame squarely on the shoulders of a peacekeeping unit, has always felt incomplete, deliberately so. A crucial piece of the puzzle was about to be revealed. My father. He served in that very same unit, Mr. John. And until the day he died, he swore that John was not the one responsible." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin as Sarah's words hung in the air, heavy with implication. David's accusatory stance wavered, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. John, his face etched with years of unspoken pain, looked at Sarah with a fragile glimmer of hope. Sarah continued, her voice resonating with conviction and a hint of long-held anger. "My father dedicated the last years of his life trying to uncover the truth about what happened that day. He believed that John and his unit were deliberately made scapegoats, their reputations tarnished to shield someone much higher up the chain of command, someone whose negligence or direct orders led to that tragic loss." Her gaze swept across the captivated faces of the passengers, drawing them into the unfolding drama. He unearthed evidence. Classified documents, recorded testimonies, inconsistencies in the official reports. Proof of a systematic cover-up designed to protect powerful individuals. A tremor of emotion ran through her voice as she added, "He died in what was ruled an accident." just weeks before he was going to go public with his findings. But I couldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. I continued his investigation. This wasn't a simple tragedy or a matter of battlefield misjudgment. This was a deliberate act of deception, a calculated manipulation of the truth to protect the guilty. And Mr. John. He and the other members of his unit have been carrying the weight of a lie for far too long. The revelation hung in the charged air, transforming the mundane reality of a transatlantic flight into a stage for a potentially explosive unveiling of injustice. The initial discomfort and petty squabbles of the journey were utterly forgotten, replaced by a shared sense of shock and the dawning realization that they were witnesses to something far more significant than a mid-air argument, a potential exposure of a long-buried truth. A hush fell over the cabin as Sarah began to meticulously lay out the findings of her father's investigation and her own subsequent research. She spoke of her father, a man of quiet integrity who had been deeply troubled by the official narrative of the peacekeeping incident. He had confided in her, sharing his growing suspicions about inconsistencies in the reports and the unusual pressure placed on their unit. Sarah recounted how her father, in his off-duty hours, had painstakingly gathered documents, copies of operational orders that seemed deliberately vague, internal memos that hinted at conflicting directives from higher command, and personal journals of fellow soldiers who had expressed similar unease. She described how he had cross-referenced these documents with publicly available information and eyewitness accounts, revealing glaring discrepancies and unanswered questions. She even played a short, crackly audio recording on her phone, a hushed conversation between her father and another soldier, expressing their concerns about the mission parameters just days before the tragic event. Sarah then detailed her own efforts after her father's death, how she had followed his leads, contacted his sources, and delved deeper into the bureaucratic labyrinth surrounding the incident. She spoke of encountering closed doors, redacted files, and a chilling reluctance from certain quarters to revisit the past. Yet, she had persevered, driven by a daughter's love and a journalist's unwavering commitment to uncovering the truth. She presented digital copies of heavily censored official reports, highlighting the sections that seemed intentionally obscured. She pointed out inconsistencies in the timeline of events as presented by the authorities and shared excerpts from interviews she had conducted with surviving members of John's unit, their accounts often contradicting the official findings. As Sarah laid out the evidence, her words acted as a catalyst for John's fragmented memories. Details that had been hazy or dismissed as insignificant began to click into place. He recalled the ambiguous nature of certain orders, the pressure from superiors to expedite the mission despite his own reservations, and the strange urgency surrounding specific directives that, in retrospect, seemed to defy logical explanation. He remembered a brief, hushed conversation he had overheard between two ranking officers just hours before the incident, a conversation that had ended abruptly when he approached. At the time, he had brushed it off as internal politics, but now, filtered through Sarah's revelations, it took on a sinister new meaning. The faces of his fellow soldiers flashed through his mind, their shared confusion, their unspoken anxieties, the sense that they were being pushed towards a predetermined outcome. He remembered Thomas, his old friend whom he was now traveling to see, expressing his own unease about the mission's objectives. Sarah's presentation wasn't just revealing a potential conspiracy, it was unlocking long-dormant memories in John's mind, allowing him to finally piece together the disjointed fragments of the past into a coherent, and deeply disturbing, picture. A sense of betrayal washed over him, the realization that they hadn't just been victims of a tragic accident, but pawns in a larger, more insidious game. David, who had been listening intently, his initial anger slowly giving way to a stunned silence, now began to show signs of a profound shift in his understanding. Sarah's meticulous presentation of evidence, coupled with John's increasingly distressed reactions, chipped away at the wall of grief and resentment he had carried for so long. The inconsistencies in the official narrative that Sarah highlighted resonated with a nagging unease he had always felt but had suppressed in his desire for someone to blame. He looked from the photograph of his sister to John's pale, troubled face, a dawning realization beginning to take root in his mind. Could he have been wrong? Could his grief have blinded him to a larger, more complex truth? The certainty that had fueled his anger for so many years began to waver, replaced by a hesitant uncertainty. He saw not a cold-blooded perpetrator, but a weary man seemingly grappling with his own painful memories, a man who appeared to be as much a victim of circumstance as anyone else. The weight of his long-held conviction began to feel suddenly, and profoundly, heavy. Finally, David lowered the photograph of his sister, his hand trembling. He looked at John, his eyes now filled with a deep sorrow, but a sorrow tinged with a dawning regret. "John," he said, his voice thick with emotion, I don't know what to say. For years, I've carried this anger, this blame. I needed someone to hold responsible for Sarah's death. And I chose you." He took a shaky breath. Hearing Sarah's, your colleagues' account, the evidence she presented, it's making me question everything I thought I knew. I may have been wrong about you. His voice cracked. I am so deeply sorry. For the accusations. For the pain I've caused you. The raw sincerity in his apology hung in the air, a fragile bridge beginning to form across the chasm of their shared tragedy. A palpable shift occurred within the cabin. The initial shock and morbid curiosity of the passengers transformed into a collective sense of empathy. Murmurs of understanding rippled through the rows as individuals processed the weight of John's unspoken burden and the potential injustice he had endured. Some reached out with comforting words, a gentle hand on his shoulder, a quiet expression of support. The shared humanity within the confined space transcended the earlier petty grievances and created an unexpected bond. Even young Alex, who had unknowingly initiated the chain of events, seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. He approached John hesitantly, clutching a small, slightly crumpled drawing in his hand. It depicted a simple airplane soaring through blue skies. With a shy glance at his mother, he offered the drawing to John. It was a small, innocent gesture, yet it spoke volumes, a silent apology and a child's intuitive understanding of the somber mood that had enveloped the adults. In the quiet aftermath, John and Sarah shared a poignant conversation. There was a newfound understanding between them, a connection forged in the crucible of shared loss and the pursuit of truth. Sarah reiterated her commitment to uncovering the full story, promising to use her journalistic platform to bring the long-buried secrets to light. John, in turn, expressed his gratitude for her courage and her father's unwavering belief in his innocence. A silent pact formed between them, a shared determination to seek justice, not just for John, but for all those who had been silenced by the lie. As the aircraft landed, the story that had unfolded within its walls began to spread beyond its confines. Passengers, moved by what they had witnessed, shared their accounts. Sarah, true to her word, began publishing her findings, the evidence meticulously laid out for the world to see. The long-suppressed truth started to surface, attracting the attention of media outlets and legal authorities. An investigation was reopened, the long-shadowed events of the past finally brought into the light of scrutiny. Time moved forward. The investigation, fueled by Sarah's relentless pursuit and the compelling testimonies of those on the flight, ultimately revealed the systemic cover-up and exonerated John and his unit. The individuals responsible for the deception were held accountable, their actions finally exposed. John, though forever bearing the scars of the past, found a measure of peace. He visited Thomas, sharing the news of the cleared names and the dawning of justice. The weight that had burdened him for so long finally began to lift. He looked at the drawing Alex had given him, a simple symbol of unexpected connection and the potential for understanding across generations, the battles fought in peacetime, the silent sacrifices and the hidden injustices. These are the stories that often go untold. The journey to understanding the full scope of our veterans' service is ongoing. What other aspects of their experiences do you think deserve more attention? Share your ideas in the comments below. And let's shape future stories together.